Hello, I'm John Davis, and in this discussion, my research project for HIUS 512 at Liberty University, American Revolution, I will cover my research regarding the American Revolution in Kentucky and its impact on the newly established Kentucky County of Virginia. In researching this project, I focused on the following question. What impact did the fighting in Kentucky during the American Revolution have on the development of the region, conduct of the Greater War, and the objectives of either side? Many are not even aware that what is now the state of Kentucky was merely the westernmost county of the state of Virginia at the outset of the American Revolution. While the first colonial settlements were Fort Harrod, established by James Harrod in 1774 at the current site of Harrodsburg, and Boonesboro, established in 1775 by Daniel Boone on behalf of the Transylvanian Company at what is now Fort Boonesboro State Park. Tensions, which were leading towards the American Revolution, had begun to build at least as far back as the Stamp and Quartering Acts of 1765, and the first shots of the war were fired on April 19th of 1775, just 18 days after Boonesboro was founded and less than a year after the founding of Harrodstown, which would become Fort Harrod on June 16th, 1774. The nature of the war in Kentucky was different than that along the Atlantic coast and was principally fought between patriotic settlers and militias on one side, with a small number of loyalist militias, British forces, and paid Indian auxiliaries forming the other. While large bodies of British regulars were not deployed into Kentucky for the most part, Britain paid its Native American allies to harass the colonial settlers, including paying bounties for scalps and prisoners. The majority of actions fought in Kentucky were fought between the Native American allies of the British, loyalist militias, as well as the patriot militias and settlers on the other side, although Britain did make one major effort to clear the western frontier of patriot support in order to influence not only the war as a whole, but the development of the region after independence. Kentucky was literally the western frontier at the time of the American Revolution. All told, there would be 8 named battles in Kentucky during the war, from the siege of Logan's Fort beginning on May 23, 1777, to the Battle of Blue Licks in 1782. The first of these Revolutionary War battles, the siege of Logan's Fort, occurred at what is now known as Stamford, Kentucky, which, like Boonesboro, was founded in 1775 by Benjamin Logan and known as the town of St. Asaph. Many sources talk of early Kentucky settlers referring to 1777 as the Bloody Sevens due to the heavy attacks on frontier outposts by British Allied Indians during that year, primarily by the Shawnee. Due to events at Boonesboro during what was called Dunmore's War, which began almost immediately after the first Kentucky settlements were established and immediately preceding the outbreak of the American Revolution, Logan appealed to other local settlers to assist him in the construction of a fort. The completed fort sat on a rise and measured roughly 90 by 150 feet, with blockhouses at the northwest and both southern corners, a conventional cabin at the northeast corner, 3 cabins forming the southern palisade between the 2 blockhouses, and 4 adjoining cabins forming the northern palisade to the east of the northwest blockhouse, with gates to both the east and west. Logan had wisely provided sheltered access to a spring via a tunnel. Indians would be spotted near the fort on 18 May, 1777, with the attack commencing on May 23rd, and the Indians withdrawing on 1 June. While Burr Harrison was the only confirmed casualty of this initial battle, with what was recorded to be 57 Indians, its importance far outweighed the numbers involved. Colonel John Bowman arrived with 100 Virginia militiamen on July 28th, with orders to escort Kentucky settlers back over the mountains if he felt they were incapable of defending themselves. Had Fort Logan and the other settlements fallen during the spring offensive, he may have found it necessary to fulfill those orders, moving the population east and ending the Western War before it even got started, eliminating the Western theater and allowing additional resources to be focused in the east, to include British forces assigned to Detroit, from which the Western campaign was largely funded and managed. As previously mentioned, Boonesboro was established as a frontier way station known as Fort Boone in April 1775 by Daniel Boone on behalf of the Transylvania Company. 1775 being the year the first shots of the American Revolution were fired, Kentucky represented the western frontier at this point, and Boone Station was one of the first settlements in the region. Boone and his party had reached the location, which lies on the western bank of the Kentucky River in Madison County, having blazed a trail into the area through the Cumberland Gap from Fort Watauga in what is now Tennessee. The choice of location for Boone Station was not accidental, being chosen 60 yards from the river and only 200 from a salt lick, giving them access to two important resources for survival most don't think twice about today: clean water and salt. Settlers soon began to call the location Fort Boone once a defensive palisade was constructed, and by 1779 it had begun being referred to as Boonesboro, becoming the first chartered town in the Kentucky region of the Commonwealth of Virginia under that name, October 1779. Daniel Boone himself would live in the settlement from 1775 to 1779 and would take part in many of the Revolutionary War actions fought in the region. In 1776, the year the Declaration of Independence was approved by the Continental Congress, Boonesboro was attacked by Indians twice. One of these attacks requiring the rescue of three girls, Jemima Boone and Fanny and Betsy Calloway, and Boone himself was shot in the ankle during an Indian attack in April of 1777 during the Spring Offensive. The siege of Boonesboro between 7 and 18 September 1778 would once again see the Shawnee under Chief Blackfish attempting to eliminate another colonial strongpoint. Prior to this, Daniel Boone had been captured by Chief Blackfish and his warriors on February 7, 1778, while leading a party of 30 men to the salt springs on the Licking River. Realizing that they were greatly outnumbered, Boone convinced his party to surrender, and while in captivity, convinced Blackfish to delay his attack until spring with a promise to surrender the fort. The captives were taken to the Shawnee town of Chillicothe, Ohio, and many were sent on to Detroit to exchange with British Governor Hamilton for the bounty for prisoners or scalps. Boone himself was adopted into a Shawnee family, but escaped on June 16th after learning of the pending attack on Boonesboro. Racing back to warn the settlement, Boone then led an expedition to raid the Shawnee village at Paint Lick to try and divert the attack, but accomplished little before they were forced to rush back to Boonesboro just ahead of Chief Blackfish's force of approximately 444 Native Americans and 12 French-American militia who had sided with the British. Facing this, the settlers had roughly 135 settlers and 40 riflemen. The settlers delayed negotiations while waiting for reinforcements from Virginia, largely led by Daniel Boone, who played on his previous interactions with Blackfish, who attempted to get Boone to honor his word that the fort would surrender. Once negotiations broke down, the Native American forces attacked, resulting in a total of 2 killed and 4 wounded from Boonesboro, and 37 killed and an unknown number of wounded from the Native American forces. Antoine Daguenau de Coindray, leader of the French-American militia, convinced Blackfish that they would be unable to take the fort without cannon to reduce the defenses after an attempt to mine them had failed, and the Native American forces withdrew on 18 September 1778. The conclusion of the siege of Boonesboro would see Daniel Boone subsequently accused of harboring loyalist sentiments and court-martialed on the following charges: that he had surrendered the salt-making party he was leading prior to the siege without a fight, that while in captivity he had promised Chief Blackfish, who had captured him, to surrender the fort to the British, that after his release that he had led an expedition to Paint Lick, weakening the defenses when the attack was imminent, and finally that he had exposed the officers to capture by agreeing to peace talks outside of the fort. Subsequently found not guilty and promoted to major, Daniel Boone would depart with a large party of settlers to form Boone Station north of the river due to his humiliation. Of the many fights and skirmishes which took place in the region, only one was a major operation initiated by the British, and this was Byrd's invasion of Kentucky in 1780, wherein Captain Henry Byrd led a force of about 150 whites and 500 Native Americans, primarily of the Shawnee, into the region. This resulted in the battles of Ruddle Station near modern-day Cynthiana. Byrd had wanted to attack Fort Nelson, located at modern-day Louisville, but his Native American allies, the Shawnee, did not want to face forces under George Rogers Clark, who was garrisoned in the area, and had been preparing for an offensive against the British. Byrd had brought the first cannon into play in the Western Theater, bringing 6 guns with him, which he used to easily reduce both Ruddle's and Martin's stations and outlying farms, returning to Detroit with over 350 prisoners and a great deal of plunder. The British Western Campaign was seen as a failure as they were unable to eliminate colonial resistance on the western frontier, despite experiencing limited success from a tactical standpoint. As a result, Clark and his forces would engage in a series of punitive raids on Native American settlements throughout the region. The last battle of the American Revolution that was fought in Kentucky was between a force of Native Americans and British allies and the Kentucky militias at the Battle of Blue Licks on August 19, 1782, 10 months after Cornwallis's surrender. This battle proved to be a resounding defeat for the Kentucky militia, but the end of the war would not see an end to British-influenced Native American hostility. As a result of this attack, General George Rogers Clark would lead a retaliatory attack on the Shawnee villages around Chillicothe, Ohio, leading over 1,000 militiamen on horseback, burning the villages and inflicting a resounding defeat on the Shawnee in the final battle of the American Revolution. On 1 June 1792, Kentucky would be recognized as a separate state, becoming the 15th state in the Union and the first west of the Appalachian Mountains. But its origins lay as a battleground of the American Revolution on the western frontier, and this origin would have lasting impact on the people who settled this region, as well as the original inhabitants, the Native Americans, who would suffer great hardship and be pushed out of the region based largely on their brutal warfare conducted in support of the British. For generations thereafter, Native Americans were considered little more than savages. The lands they continued to lay claim to divided up as bounties for Revolutionary War veterans, while their loyalist allies had been run off and their property seized as well. The war in Kentucky had been hard fought and brutal. It would see great acts of bravery and resoluteness, which would soon see it lifted to statehood. It saw its first settlements turned to fortresses based on the early settlers' determination to tame this place and make it their own. And in doing so, they helped dilute the British efforts in the East, influencing the greater war through their resolute refusal to surrender. Thank you.